If you'd like to learn how to accurately match any colour using acrylic paints, then this video is for you. This is such an important skill to learn, and once you understand the process, it becomes so much easier to match any colour you need. Colour matching is really important because you won't always have the exact colour that you want straight out of a paint tube. Knowing how to mix the colours you already have to create a very specific shade is incredibly useful. If you're following one of my tutorials, or anyone else's, and you don't have the exact same paints being used, being able to colour match means that you can still achieve the same result. It's also an essential skill when painting from life or from a reference photo, where accurately matching the colours of your subject can make a huge difference to how realistic your painting looks. So how do we actually match a colour? First, we need to break the colour down into 4 sections: hue, temperature, value, and saturation. Hue is the actual colour itself, whether it's green, red, blue, and so on. Temperature refers to how warm or cool that colour is. For example, a warm yellowy green versus a cool blue-green. Value is how light or dark the colour is, such as dark green or a light green. And saturation is how vibrant or muted the colour is. For example, it could be a very saturated shade of green or a much softer, more natural shade. A great way to practice colour matching is to get a sample booklet from a paint shop. You can usually order these for free online, and they're filled with hundreds of different shades that are perfect for practicing. If you haven't already, I'd highly recommend watching my colour mixing video, which I'll link to below. In that video, I go into much more detail about colour theory, and understanding those fundamentals makes colour matching so much easier. Here's a quick overview of colour theory, especially the parts that are most important for colour matching. To mix a specific hue, we can work with primary colours to create the colour that we want. However, as I mentioned in my colour theory video, this doesn't just mean having one red, one blue, and one yellow tube of paint. This is where colour temperature becomes really important. Every colour can have either a warm or a cool temperature. Even a cool colour like blue can have a warm version. For example, I'll show you 2 blues, ultramarine and phthocyanine. They're both quite dark, but when we add a little bit of white, the difference becomes much clearer. Ultramarine blue is much warmer and leans more towards violet, while phthalo blue is much cooler and leans towards turquoise. That's because ultramarine blue has red undertones, whereas phthalo blue has yellow undertones. This applies to all colours. For example, with red we can have a warm red with yellow undertones like Pyrrole red, and a cool red with blue undertones like magenta. Colour temperature is so important when matching colours because if we choose the wrong temperature, it can actually make it impossible to mix the shade that we're aiming for. That's due to the underlying colours within the paint itself. For example, no matter how hard I try, I can't use a warm red to create a bright pink. Warm red contains yellow, and yellow sits almost on the opposite side of the colour wheel to pink. When we mix colours that are opposite each other on the colour wheel, complementary colours, they desaturate each other, which results in a duller shade. So if we want a bright, vibrant pink, we need to start with a cool red that has blue undertones, such as magenta. When it comes to value, which is lightening or darkening a colour, it might seem natural to use white to lighten and black to darken. However, adding white or black will also desaturate the colour. Black and white sit on the grey scale, so when we add them to a colour, we're essentially adding grey, which will reduce the vibrancy. That can be perfect if you're trying to match a muted or natural shade, but if you're aiming for something more vibrant, you may need to lighten or darken using other colours instead. For example, with green, you could use a dark blue to darken it, or a bright yellow to lighten it while maintaining its vibrancy. So let's use this knowledge to try and match this colour here. First, we need to figure out what colour it is. We can start with the basic hue and then narrow it down to get more precise. The basic colour here is orange. To make orange, we can mix some warm red and yellow paint together. As you can see, red is quite a strong colour, so I'm adding more yellow to reach that orange hue. It's going to be far too bright at this stage, but don't worry, we'll tone it down in the next steps. Next, we can focus on the value. This is a light shade, so we'll need to lighten it. Since the colour we're matching is quite muted, we can use white to lighten it, as this will both lighten and slightly desaturate it at the same time. Now that I've lightened it, I can see it's leaning too much towards yellow, so I'm adding a bit more red to make the hue more accurate. And then a little bit more white to increase the lightness. The temperature of the orange is looking slightly too warm at the moment, so to cool it down I'm adding a small amount of magenta, which is a cooler red than the Pyrrole red I've been using. Right now the colour is still too saturated. To reduce the vibrancy we can add a small amount of the complementary colour to orange, which is blue. A little goes a very long way. As you can see, I added slightly too much, so I'm mixing in a bit more red, yellow and white to rebalance it. But you can see that the vibrancy has reduced and it's starting to look much more accurate. It's still slightly too dark and too vibrant, so I'll add a bit more white. The value is much closer now, but it's still just a little bit too saturated, so I'm adding a tiny amount of magenta and blue to reduce the vibrancy further. A touch more white and I'd say we're just about there. We only had to use 5 colours to get almost a perfect match. Let's try to match another colour, like this green here. It's green, so we'll mix blue and yellow to create the base colour. It's a warm green, so I'll add more yellow because it's looking a bit too cool at the moment. Once we're happy with the hue and the temperature, we can move on to the value. It's very bright right now, so I'm adding a small amount of black to darken it slightly and reduce some of the vibrancy. Use black very sparingly because once it's in the mix, it's difficult to bring the brightness back. I actually think it's slightly too dark now, so I'm lightening it with some white, which will also help to mute it a little, which is what we want. Now we can focus on saturation. It's quite a natural shade of green, but my mixture is still way too saturated. To desaturate it, we can add a tiny amount of the complementary colour. The colour opposite green on the colour wheel is red, so I'm adding a very small amount of red. Adding complementary colours often darkens the mixture slightly as well, so I may need to adjust the value again, which is why I'm adding a bit more white. It's looking much closer now, but still slightly too saturated, so I'm adding a little bit more red. The red really helps to create a much more natural looking green. It's just a touch too dark, so I'll add a bit more white and a tiny bit more red to reduce the vibrancy further, and I'd say we're almost there. It's just slightly too warm, so I'm adding a very small amount of blue and finally a tiny bit of white. I'd say that's quite accurate. Let's mix one more, a slightly more vibrant colour this time, like this teal. It's a very cool green, so we'll want much more blue than yellow. This mixture is obviously too dark, and adding bright yellow would shift the hue too much, so I'm lightening it with white. The colour is actually more muted than I first thought, so I'll need to add some complementary colour to tone it down. Since this sits between green and blue, either red or orange could work. I'll start with red. Because my mixture is leaning more towards blue, I think orange will actually work better to desaturate it. It's still looking slightly too blue compared to the colour I'm trying to match, so I'm adding a little bit more yellow and a bit of white to lighten it. It's very close now, but slightly too saturated. So I'm adding a little bit more orange, although I've gone slightly too far and dulled it a bit too much. A tiny bit of white brightens it just enough, and I'd say that's just about right. I'd really recommend practicing these colour matching techniques whenever you can. The more you practice, the more instinctive it becomes, and before long you'll know exactly which colours to use to perfectly match any shade. You can practice with a colour booklet like this, or even with objects you find around your house. I hope this video has been helpful. I also have other videos on colour theory, colour mixing, and how to make your colours brighter and more vibrant, so be sure to check those out for more tips like these. If you'd like to learn how to paint full acrylic paintings step by step, you can join my Patreon, Rachel Froud Art, where you'll get access to all of my full-length art tutorials. Thanks for watching!